"I can't pay you," whispered the widow. The wind carried her words across the dry yard, where dust rolled like smoke from a dying fire. It was late afternoon in Pine Hollow, 1887. The sky had that brittle gold light that comes before sundown when even the air feels tired. Ruth Callahan stood beside a broken fence post, her hands trembling against the splintered wood. The hem of her dress was torn, the fabric smudged with earth and sweat. A few yards away, a horse stamped on the ground. Beside it stood a man, tall, lean, with his hat pulled low against the wind. He said nothing for a long while, only watched her with eyes that seemed to carry the same dust as the land. Then slowly he stepped forward. "Then don't," he said. His voice was low, steady. "Just stay." Ruth looked up, startled. The way he said it, not as an offer but as a promise, made her throat tighten. She wanted to speak but couldn't. The cowboy set his saddlebag down and pulled off his gloves. Without another word, he picked up the hammer she'd dropped and began to drive a new nail into the fence post. Each strike echoed across the empty field. The widow watched him in silence, her jaw trembling. It had been months since anyone had worked beside her without pity in their eyes. A storm cloud drifted across the sun and the light dimmed. The sound of the hammer, the breath of wind through dry grass, the faint creak of wood, all of it folded into the moment like a hymn. "You don't even know my name," she said at last. He paused, resting the hammer on the post. "Don't need to. Fence still needs fixing." A strange warmth touched her chest, something she hadn't felt since her husband Eli died. Still, she turned away, wiping her hands on her apron. "You shouldn't waste your time here," she murmured. "This land breaks more than it gives," he shrugged. "Then I'll break with it." The words landed softly but stayed in her head long after. By dusk, the last board was set. The cowboy led his horse to the corral and tied it loosely, as if testing whether the land would let him stay. Inside the small cabin, Ruth lit the lantern. The glass shook in her hands. She didn't know why she'd let him stay, only that the silence after her husband's death had become too heavy to bear alone. Through the window, she saw him still standing near the fence, staring out toward the dark horizon. That night, the wind rose. The shutters rattled. Ruth sat by the small fire, her Bible open but unread. The house creaked like it remembered ghosts. When a knock sounded on the door, she flinched. "Ma'am," came his voice, low and careful. "Your barn door's come loose. I'll fix it before it breaks clean off." She hesitated, then nodded even though he couldn't see her. "All right. Thank you, Mr. Luke," he said through the wind. When his footsteps faded, she whispered the name to herself. Luke Garner. It fit somehow. Plain, strong, steady as the earth. Outside, he worked under the lantern's glow, his shadow long against the barn wall. The nails clicked, the boards thudded, and the night seemed less cruel for it. Inside, Ruth closed her Bible, the verse unread. Instead, she watched the fire, the way its light trembled like hope learning to stand again. And when Luke finally walked past her window, heading toward the bunkhouse that hadn't seen a soul in months, she didn't call out to stop him. But she didn't feel alone anymore. The lantern flickered once, and the room fell still. The morning came cold and gray, the kind of morning that smelled of wet earth and regret. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, arms folded tight against the chill. Mist still clung to the valley floor, and somewhere out in that fog, Luke Garner was already at work. She heard the soft rhythm of an axe. Wood splitting. The clean sound of labor. When she followed the noise, she found him behind the barn, stacking neat rows of firewood. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, breath rising in small clouds. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly. He didn't stop. "You need heat." "Winter's coming fast," she wanted to protest again, but his calmness made it useless. Instead, she just stood there watching the way he worked. Steady, patient, like a man who needed the silence as much as she did. After a moment, she asked, "You travel alone?" He nodded once. "Always have." Ruth waited for him to say more, but he didn't. He set another log, swung the axe clean through, and placed the split piece on the pile. When he finally glanced at her, she looked away first. Inside the cabin, she poured coffee, strong and bitter. The smell filled the air, grounding her to something simple and human. She poured a second cup, hesitated, then carried it outside. "Here," she said, holding it out. He took it without a word, nodded his thanks, and leaned against the fence. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't the heavy kind. It was quiet in a way that made breathing easier. Then Ruth spoke almost to herself. "They said the ranch would die after Eli passed. Said I should sell and go east to my sister. I tried to keep it going, but folks stopped coming round after what happened." Luke looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "What did happen?" She hesitated. "Eli drowned in the creek. At least that's what the coroner wrote." Her voice trembled on the word drowned. "But the creek was shallow," she went on, "and Eli could swim since he was a boy. That's what never made sense." Luke didn't speak. The air between them changed, not pity, but quiet understanding. "After that," Ruth continued, "men from the bank started coming around, asking about the land, about selling. Said I couldn't keep it alone." She looked toward the barn. "Maybe they're right." Luke's gaze followed hers. "Maybe they just want what's not theirs." For the first time, Ruth met his eyes fully. "You sound sure of that." He set the cup down. "I've seen it before. A widow left with landmen can't stand seeing wasted on someone who won't give it up." The words hit hard. Ruth turned away, her breath shaking. "You don't know Pine Hollow. Folks here have long memories and short mercy." Luke adjusted his hat. "I don't need their mercy." His tone wasn't angry, just firm, like a man stating a fact about the weather. Ruth felt her throat tighten. "You could leave. No one would blame you." He looked out toward the hills where the fog was starting to lift. Not yet. And then he went back to work, lifting another piece of wood as if that settled it. Later, when the sun broke through the mist, Ruth stood by the creek where Eli had died. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky. A single boot print marked the mud near the bank, too fresh to be from years ago. Her heart thudded. She glanced toward the ridge, half expecting to see someone watching, but there was nothing, just the quiet sound of the stream and the faint call of a crow overhead. Behind her, Luke's voice came steady and close. "You all right, Mrs. Callahan?" She turned quickly, startled that he'd followed her. "Yes," she said too fast. "Just thinking." He studied the creek, then her face. "Some places remember what happened. You just have to listen." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of damp grass and wood smoke. Ruth shivered, not from cold, but from the feeling that her life was shifting. Quietly and without permission, she looked back at the water. "I wish it could all just stay buried." Luke's voice was soft, almost sad. "Truth doesn't stay buried long in this kind of land." The sun slipped higher, lighting the dust motes in the air. Ruth turned toward the cabin. Luke followed a few steps behind, silent again. In the distance, the church bell of Pine Hollow rang once, low and hollow, like a warning. By the week's end, Luke had fixed the fence line, patched the barn roof, and mended the chicken coop door that had been hanging loose since spring. He worked like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Ruth watched from the porch, her hands clasped around a chipped mug, unsure what to make of the quiet strength he carried. The townsfolk had already started talking. Pine Hollow had a way of noticing everything and forgiving nothing. When Ruth rode into town for flour and feed, whispers followed her like dust on her boots. "Widow Callahan's got herself a ranch hand," one woman muttered near the store porch. "Ranch hand?" Another laughed. "More like company she ain't paying." Ruth kept her eyes forward, shoulders square. But the words dug deep. Inside the store she moved quickly, avoiding familiar faces. Old Mr. Grady, the storekeeper, bagged her sugar and lard with a slow, knowing grin. "You still keeping that drifter around?" He's helping with repairs, Ruth said, keeping her voice steady. Sure, Grady said. But men don't work for free, not out here. Ruth met his gaze, jaw tight. He's different, Grady shrugged, ringing up the sale. Maybe. But folks'll make what they want of it. When she stepped outside, Luke was waiting beside her wagon, reins in hand. He'd come down from the smithy, his shirt damp with sweat, dust coating his hat brim. Problem? He asked, his tone quiet but sharp. She shook her head. Just town talk. He looked past her at the porch where the women still lingered. Their voices fell to whispers. Luke said nothing, but his eyes went hard. He loaded the supplies and climbed onto the wagon bench beside her. The road home was long and silent, the wheels creaking over dry ruts. Finally, Ruth spoke. You'll catch trouble if you stay. They don't like strangers much. Luke's voice was calm. I ain't here for them. The simple answer struck her harder than any defense could have. As they neared the ranch, a man on horseback appeared by the gate. Silas Horn, the town banker. His suit looked too fine for the dust, his smile too wide to be kind. Mrs. Callahan, he greeted, tipping his hat. Been meaning to stop by. Ruth's stomach turned. Mr. Horn, what brings you here? Business, he said, glancing at Luke. And a bit of neighborly concern. Luke stayed quiet, hand resting near his holster, but casual enough not to draw attention. Silas dismounted, brushing the dirt from his coat. You've missed 2 payments on the loan. I'm afraid the bank can't keep waiting forever. I told you, Ruth said. The cattle will sell next month. You'll have your money. Silas smiled thinly. Of course. But I can't help noticing you've hired new help. Must mean things are looking up. Ruth stiffened. He's not hired. He's a friend. Luke's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Friend? Silas echoed. Well, friendship doesn't pay the bank, Mrs. Callahan. You should be careful who you bring around. Folks might start wondering what else you're trading. Ruth's face flushed. Luke stepped forward once, slow but deliberate. That's enough. Silas turned toward him, amused. You must be the drifter people are whispering about. I'll give you a bit of advice, Cowboy. Pine Hollow has no use for strays. Luke's eyes didn't move from his. Then maybe Pine Hollow needs changing. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Silas smirked, tipped his hat again, and climbed back on his horse. Be sure to keep your gate locked, he said over his shoulder. Bad things happen when a widow can't keep her debt when or her company on in line. As he rode off, Ruth realized her hands were shaking. Luke stepped closer, his shadow crossing hers. You shouldn't have said that, she whispered. Silas Horn owns half this town. Luke's voice was low. Maybe it's time someone reminded him he doesn't own you. Ruth turned away quickly, blinking against the sting in her eyes. You don't understand, Luke. Men like him, they get what they want, always. He looked toward the ridge where Silas had gone. Not this time. That night a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked over the hills and the rain came hard, washing the dust from the world. Ruth stood by the window, watching lightning flash over the fields. Luke sat by the hearth, mending a broken bridle strap, his face lit by firelight. Why'd you stay? She asked softly. You could have ridden on. He didn't look up. Because some places feel wrong until you set them right. Ruth turned back to the rain. Somewhere deep down she knew that by letting him stay, she'd already chosen a side, and there would be no turning back. The storm passed by morning, leaving the land washed and quiet. The air smelled of wet dust and pine. Ruth walked the yard, boots sinking into soft mud. The ranch looked almost new, the fences glistening, the roof dark with rain. But she knew better. Water could hide rot for a while, not cure it. Luke was already outside checking the horses. He moved calmly and sure, patting their necks, speaking to them in that low, steady way that made even nervous animals settle. Ruth watched from the porch for a while before walking toward him. Fence held through the storm, she said. He nodded. You built it right, she smiled faintly. You mean we built it right? He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, unspoken but real. The kind of understanding that didn't need words. After breakfast, Ruth went to the barn to fetch seed for the hens. As she lifted the sack, something caught her eye. A glint of metal near the back wall. She knelt, brushing away straw and dirt until her fingers found it. A pocket watch, dented and stained. Her breath caught. She turned it over. The initials EC were carved on the back. Eli Callahan, her late husband's watch. But it shouldn't have been there. He'd worn it the day he died. They'd never found it afterward. Ruth's stomach turned cold. The back clasp was bent as though it had been dropped hard. She opened it and a faint smear of dried mud lined the hinge. Fresh mud. Not years old, she froze. Someone had put it there recently. Everything all right? Luke's voice came from behind her. She spun around, the watch clutched tight in her hand. She hesitated. I found something. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he saw it. That belonged to your husband, she nodded. It went missing after he died. I don't understand how it ended up here. Luke studied it, his brow furrowed. You said he drowned by the creek. Yes. He crouched, picking up a bit of the mud that still clung to the straw. This isn't creek mud. It's from the fence line, near the north ridge. Ruth stared at him, confused. How can you tell? Because I've been fixing that fence for 3 days, he said quietly. And this? He rubbed the dirt between his fingers. This is the same red clay that sticks to your boots up there. She blinked, shaken. Then whoever moved it was on the property. Recently, Luke's jaw tightened. You ever see anyone near that ridge? She thought back. A few days ago I noticed tracks by the old gate. I thought it was a deer. He nodded slowly. Wasn't deer. For a long moment they said nothing. Rainwater dripped from the eaves outside, soft and steady. Then Ruth whispered, Do you think he was murdered, Luke? Eli? Luke looked at her, steady, honest. I think someone wanted what he had, and when they couldn't scare him off, they made sure he left it behind. Her eyes filled with tears, not from grief this time, but from anger long buried. And now they're trying to take it from me. He set a hand on her shoulder. Then we don't let them. The word steadied her, though her heart still raced. That evening, Luke walked the ridge while Ruth stayed near the house. The sunset bled red across the sky, long shadows reaching over the land. He crouched near the fence post where he'd replaced a rail, and saw it, boot prints in the soft earth. One set leading toward the creek, the other back toward town. When he followed them a little farther, he found something else, a torn scrap of paper half buried in mud. It was from a letter. Only a few words were legible. Deed. Horn. Make sure, Luke's mouth set into a grim line. Silas Horn again. He folded the scrap carefully and tucked it into his pocket. When he returned to the cabin, Ruth was waiting by the fire, her eyes anxious. Find anything? She asked. He handed her the paper. Enough to know this isn't over. She read the name, her face pale in the firelight. He killed Eli, didn't he? Luke didn't answer directly. Men like him don't get their hands dirty, but they pay others who will. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows like restless ghosts. Ruth looked toward the dark fields. If he sent someone once, he could send them again. Luke stepped to the window, scanning the ridge. Then we'll be ready. The firelight flickered against his face, calm, resolute, like a man who'd already made peace with danger. Ruth watched him for a long moment. Somewhere deep inside her, fear gave way to something steadier. Trust. The night deepened and the light from the cabin spilled into the yard, a single flame against the dark. The next morning dawned bright but uneasy. The storm had left the world shining clean, yet something in the air felt heavier than before. Ruth woke early, her mind restless from a night without real sleep. She brewed coffee, set a cup by the window, and watched Luke saddle his horse in the yard. He moved with the same quiet focus as always, but there was a new tension in his shoulders and a man expecting trouble. Where are you headed? She called softly through the open window. Into town, he said. Need to see a man about that paper we found. Ruth stepped onto the porch, the morning light brushing her face. You mean Silas? Luke nodded once. If he's behind this, I want to see how deep it goes. Her stomach tightened. Be careful. He owns more than the bank. The sheriff listens to him. I ain't looking for a fight, Luke said, tightening the saddle strap. Just the truth. But Ruth knew men like Silas didn't give truth. They buried it. She watched him ride out, the sun catching on his hat brim before he disappeared down the road. Then she turned back to her chores, though her hands shook too much to do them right. Luke rode into Pine Hollow near noon. The town was alive with dust and voices, wagons rolling past, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, dogs barking near the saloon. He tied his horse outside the bank and stepped onto the boardwalk, boots thudding against the dry wood. Inside, Silas Horn looked up from behind his polished desk. His smile was the same as before, and pleasant and false. Well, Mr. Garner, Silas said smoothly. Didn't expect you back in town so soon. What brings you here? Luke stayed standing. Business. He laid the torn scrap of paper on the desk. Found this on Ruth Callahan's land. Silas's smile didn't fade, but his eyes flickered for a moment. Strange thing to find. Looks like part of a letter. Your name's on it, that so? Silas picked up the paper with care, turning it between his fingers. Hard to tell where it came from. Wind blows all kinds of trash around after a storm. Luke didn't move. Funny thing. The mud on it matches the ridge near the Callahan fence. You'd have to ride out there to lose it. Silas set the paper down. You sound like you're accusing me of something. Just sounds like you've been somewhere you shouldn't. The banker's tone sharpened. Let me remind you, Mr. Garner, you're a stranger here. You've no claim, no standing. The widow's debts are her own concern, and the law's not yours. Luke's eyes stayed cold. Law doesn't mean much when it's bought. Silas rose slowly from his chair. Careful what you're saying. Luke stepped closer. I'm not the one who needs to be careful. For a long second, neither man spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the faint rattle of wind against the glass. Finally, Silas smiled again. That thin, measured smile of a man who thought he'd already won. You think you're her protector? I've seen your kind before. Strays looking for a cause. You'll leave soon enough. They always do? Luke leaned forward slightly, voice low and steady. Not this time. Then he turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Silas stood alone in his fine office, staring after him. His smile slipped just a little. Back at the ranch, Ruth tried to keep herself busy, feeding the hens, mending torn linens, sweeping the porch, but the work couldn't chase away the feeling that eyes were on her. Near sundown, she went to fetch water from the well and stopped cold. Boot prints. Deep ones, fresh in the damp soil. She looked around. The yard was still. Only the creaking of the windmill and the lowing of cattle broke the quiet. But someone had been there, and recently. Ruth dropped the bucket and ran to the barn. The door hung slightly open, not the way Luke left it. Inside, the horses shifted nervously. She stepped in, holding her breath. A movement flashed behind the hay bales, quick, deliberate. Who's there? She called. No answer. Just the rustle of straw. Then a shape lunged forward. Ruth screamed. A rough hand grabbed her arm, but before she could struggle, a gunshot cracked from outside. The man froze, his grip loosening. Another shot hit the barn beam above his head, showering dust. Let her go! Luke's voice thundered from the doorway. The man bolted, darting past Ruth and out the back. Luke ran after him, firing once more into the air. The intruder vanished into the dusk, swallowed by the open fields. Ruth stood trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. Luke came back moments later, gun still in hand, breathing hard. You hurt? He asked. She shook her head, eyes wide. He came out of nowhere. Luke holstered his gun. He wasn't here to steal. Ruth swallowed hard. Then why? He looked toward the ridge, where the last light of day was dying behind the hills. To scare you. Or worse. The silence that followed was heavy. Ruth clutched her shawl tighter, her voice breaking. This won't stop, will it? Luke's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Not till we make it stop. And the night after the attack was long and sleepless. Ruth sat by the fire, a blanket around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the flames. Every sound outside, a creak, a gust of wind, a horse shifting in the corral, made her heart jump. Luke sat across from her, sharpening his knife in silence. The rasp of steel on stone was steady, almost soothing. Finally, Ruth spoke. "You think Silas sent that man?" Luke didn't look up. "He's the only one who gains from scaring you off." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "He's already taken enough. My husband, my peace, almost my land." Luke's hand paused mid-motion. "He won't take anything else." There was no anger in his voice. Only certainty. The kind that didn't come from pride, but from something deeper. After a long pause, Ruth said softly, "I used to think Eli's death was my punishment. For wanting more than I should have had. For believing this land could be ours forever." Luke looked at her then, his eyes dark in the firelight. "You didn't do wrong by wanting something good." She gave a weak smile. "You sound like you believe that." "I do." Outside, thunder grumbled far away, another storm brewing somewhere beyond the hills. Ruth sighed. "You should leave while you can. If Silas wants blood, he'll come for you next." Luke stood and walked to the window. "Let him," she followed his gaze. The night was deep and wide, the sky heavy with clouds. "You can't fight a whole town." "I'm not fighting the town," he said quietly. "Just one man who thinks fear can buy him everything." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "You get some rest." "I'll keep watch." Ruth hesitated. "You'll stay out there all night?" He nodded once. "I've had worse company than the dark." She wanted to protest, but the look in his eyes told her not to. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." Luke tipped his hat slightly, then stepped outside. The door closed with a soft click, and Ruth listened to the sound of his boots fading into the yard. The next morning, the sun rose pale and cold. Ruth found Luke near the corral, leaning against a post, eyes red from a night without sleep. "Anything?" she asked. He shook his head. "Quiet, too quiet." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Maybe they won't come back." He gave a faint smile. "Maybe. But fear doesn't end because daylight comes." Ruth nodded, her heart heavy. "What will you do now?" "Find proof," Luke said. "Something the sheriff can't ignore." Ruth's brow furrowed. "You said the sheriff listens to Silas." Luke took a sip of coffee. "Then we'll make him listen to something louder." Before she could ask what he meant, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Ruth tensed, looking toward the ridge. A rider approached, the sheriff himself, coat flapping, dust rising behind him. "Morning, Mrs. Callahan," Sheriff Tate called, pulling up beside the fence. His eyes flicked to Luke. "Garner," Luke nodded. "Sheriff," Tate adjusted his hat. "Heard there was some trouble last night." Ruth's voice shook. "A man broke into the barn." Luke scared him off. The sheriff sighed. "Could be just a drifter passing through." Luke's tone was sharp. "Drifters don't know where a widow keeps her feed sacks." The sheriff looked at him hard. "You saying someone from town's behind it?" "I'm saying the banker's been too interested in this land since her husband died." The sheriff frowned. "That's a strong claim." "Got proof?" Luke pulled the folded scrap of paper from his coat and handed it over. Tate read it, then looked up unimpressed. "Half a letter doesn't prove a crime." Ruth stepped forward. "What about the watch?" "It was buried on my land and fresh mud on it. Someone's been coming here at night." Tate hesitated, his eyes softening slightly. "Mrs. Callahan, I know this has been hard, but you can't accuse a man like Silas Horn without solid evidence. He's powerful in this county." Luke crossed his arms. "That power's exactly why he thinks he can get away with it." The sheriff's voice hardened. "Watch yourself, Garner. Folks don't take kindly to strangers stirring trouble." Luke stepped closer, his tone low. "Sometimes trouble's already there. It just needs to be seen." A tense silence followed. Then the sheriff folded the paper and handed it back. "I'll look into it," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. He tipped his hat and rode off down the trail. Ruth watched him go, her hands trembling. He's not going to help us, is he? Luke shook his head. No, not until we force him to. Ruth looked toward the barn where the morning light cut through the open doors. Then what do we do? Luke's eyes were steady. We make them come to us. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Ruth didn't understand his plan yet, but for the first time she felt something close to courage stirring beneath her fear. And the day stretched long and uneasy. Ruth tried to go about her chores, but every small sound set her nerves on edge. A door creak, a hoarse snort, the flap of a loose shutter. Luke stayed mostly outside, checking the fence line again and again, though Ruth suspected he was really watching the horizon. By mid-afternoon, the air had turned heavy. The light seemed sharper, the quiet deeper. Even the cattle stayed close to the barn as if they sensed something coming. Ruth found Luke near the porch, crouched beside his saddlebag, cleaning his revolver. You think they'll come back? She asked. He looked up, eyes calm. If they're working for Horn, they will. Men like that don't take being warned off kindly. Ruth swallowed. And what if they don't stop next time? Luke slid the revolver back into its holster. Then we make sure they regret trying. His voice was even, not cruel, but it carried a quiet certainty that made Ruth's heart tremble. She knelt beside him. Luke, I don't want blood on this land again. He met her eyes. Neither do I, but sometimes peace has to be earned. Before she could answer, they both heard it. Distant hoofbeats, faint but growing louder. Luke stood scanning the ridge. 3 riders appeared, cutting across the field. Ruth's breath caught. It's them. Luke's hand went to his gun, but he didn't draw. Go inside. Bolt the door. I won't leave you alone. He gave her a small, grim smile. You're not. Just stay where it's safe. Ruth hesitated, then nodded and ran for the house. From the window, she saw Luke step out into the yard, his stance relaxed but ready. The riders slowed as they neared, their horses kicking up dry dust. The one in front, a thick-set man with a scar across his cheek, grinned down at Luke. You, the drifter guarding the widow? He called. Luke said nothing. The man laughed. Horn says you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Luke's eyes narrowed. Then Horn ought to come say that himself. He's a busy man, the rider said. Sent us to remind you to clear out tonight. Luke's voice stayed calm. You boys sure you want to be on the wrong side of this? The man spat. Wrong side's wherever Horn ain't. Without warning, his hand went for his gun. But Luke was faster. 2 quick shots cracked through the dry air. One hit the man's pistol clean from his grip. The other struck the dirt by his horse's hooves. The animal reared, throwing the man backward into the dust. The other 2 riders froze, unsure. Luke held steady, his revolver raised but aimed low. Tell your boss this is his only warning, Luke said. Next time he sends men to threaten a woman, they won't ride back. The fallen man scrambled up, cursing. He looked ready to fire, but his friends pulled him away. Go on, Luke said, voice quiet as thunder. Before I change my mind. The men turned their horses and rode hard back toward town, leaving a trail of dust behind them. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, Ruth burst out the door. Luke, he turned, lowering his gun. You all right? I should be asking you that, she said, breathless. I'm fine. He holstered his revolver, but his eyes stayed on the distant ridge. They'll tell Horn what happened. He won't let it go. Ruth shook her head. Then what happens now? Luke looked at her, his expression unreadable. Now he knows we're not afraid. She stepped closer. Maybe you aren't, but I am. Every day since Eli died, I've been afraid of losing this place. Of losing everything. Luke's voice softened. You've held on longer than most would have. That takes more courage than any gunfight. Her eyes shone with tears. And what if courage isn't enough? He reached out, resting a hand gently on her arm. Then you don't stand alone. The moment stretched between them, the quiet after danger, filled with something new and fragile. But before either could speak again, The sound of a wagon echoed from down the trail. Ruth turned toward it, heart pounding. It was the sheriff's wagon, rolling fast. Dust rose behind the wheels. When it stopped by the gate, Sheriff Tate climbed down, his face pale and tight. "Mrs. Callahan," he called. "Mr. Garner, there's been trouble in town." Luke frowned. "What kind of trouble?"
Tate hesitated.
"Silas Horne's office burned last night."
"He says someone broke in and stole property deeds before setting the fire." Ruth's eyes widened.
"Deeds? You mean your ranch among them," the sheriff said. "Horne claims you had reason to do it." Ruth's breath caught. "That's a lie." Tate nodded grimly. "Maybe so, but he's pressing charges." Luke's hand curled into a fist. "He's framing her," the sheriff sighed. "Maybe, but until I can prove otherwise, I've got to take her in." The air went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ruth stared at him, stunned. "Sheriff, please." Tate looked at her with weary eyes. "I don't like it either, ma'am. But law's the law." Luke stepped forward, his voice low and hard. "Not when the law's bought and paid for." The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster. "Don't make this worse, Garner." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ruth spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "It's all right, Luke. If I run, he wins. If I stay, maybe the truth can still come out." Luke's jaw tightened. "I won't let him do this," but Ruth touched his arm gently. "You already did more than anyone ever would." The sheriff led her toward the wagon as the sun dipped low behind the hills. Luke stood watching, dust swirling around his boots, helpless but burning inside. As the wagon rolled away, Ruth turned once, meeting his eyes through the fading light. Luke's heart hardened with one promise. This wasn't over. Luke didn't sleep that night. The stars burned cold over Pine Hollow and the wind moaned through the cottonwoods like a warning. He sat on the porch, Ruth's shawl still draped over the chair where she'd left it. Her scent of lavender and smoke clung faintly to the cloth. He couldn't stand just waiting. At dawn, he saddled his horse and rode toward town. The main street was quiet but not empty. Folks had already heard the news. The widow Callahan, accused of arson and theft. Luke could feel their eyes on him as he dismounted outside the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tate met him at the door. "She's inside," he said. "I told Horne we'll hold her until the circuit judge rides through next week." "Next week's too long," Luke said flatly. The sheriff crossed his arms. "You planning on breaking her out? That'd only make things worse." Luke's jaw tightened. "Then tell me who says she did it." Tate sighed. "Horne's got a witness. Claims he saw Ruth near his office the night of the fire." Luke frowned. "Who?" "Jed Weller." Luke's expression darkened. Jed Weller, one of Horne's hired hands, a man who'd been part of the group that torched the Callahan barn months ago. Luke's voice dropped. "That man lies for pay." "I know," Tate said quietly. "But in this town, Horne's word carries more weight than truth." Luke looked past the sheriff, through the bars of the holding cell. Ruth sat inside, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but calm. When she saw Luke, her eyes softened. "You shouldn't have come," she said. He stepped closer to the bars. "Couldn't stay away." She gave a faint smile. "You can't fix this one with a gun." "Didn't come to shoot my way through," he said. "Came to find the truth." Ruth looked down. "You'll just end up like Eli, dead for standing up to men who think they own everything." Luke reached through the bars, brushing her fingers with his. "Maybe. But Eli didn't have me watching his back." Before she could reply, a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas Horne stepped in, his fine coat dusted with ash, his smirk cold. Well, well," he drawled, "if it isn't the hired hand playing hero." Luke turned, his eyes like flint. "You set her up," Horne chuckled. "I don't need to set up anyone, Garner. Law's already on my side." He looked toward Ruth. You could have saved yourself the trouble, Mrs. Callahan. You sell me that ranch, and I'll tell the judge it was all a misunderstanding. Ruth's voice trembled, but she stood. You murdered my husband for that land, Silas. I'll die before I give it to you. Horn's smile faltered for just a second. Then he sneered. Careful what you say, widow. Words like that can turn a crowd ugly. Luke took a step forward. You've got about 2 seconds to leave, Horn. The banker met his stare, then laughed. Still pretending you matter? You're a drifter, Garner. When I'm done, they'll say you torched my office with her. Luke's hand twitched near his belt, but Ruth's soft voice stopped him. Don't, she whispered. Horn tipped his hat mockingly. See you in court, if she makes it that long. He left, boots echoing on the wooden floor. Luke exhaled slowly, rage tight in his chest. Ruth looked at him, worry clouding her eyes. He's not done, Luke. You can see it in him. I know, Luke said quietly, which is why I'm going to find something he can't bury. He turned to the sheriff. Tate, you still got the case file from Eli Callahan's death? Tate frowned. It's closed. Then open it, Luke said, 'cause if Horn killed him, there's gotta be proof. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. You've got till sundown. After that, I can't help you. Luke tipped his hat in thanks, then left. The day turned gray and still as he rode out to the far edge of Ruth's land, to the creek where Eli Callahan had fallen. The water ran low this season, cutting shallow lines through the red mud. Luke dismounted and walked the bank slowly, scanning the ground. Near the old crossing, he spotted something glinting under the mud, a piece of metal half buried. He knelt and pulled it free. A revolver. Rusted, worn, but still loaded, and carved into the grip, faint but clear. S.H. Luke's stomach knotted. Silas Horn's initials. He stared at the gun for a long moment, the sound of the creek whispering through the silence. Then he stood, the weight of it heavy in his hand. When he rode back toward town, the sun was sinking red through the clouds, like blood spreading across the sky. He wasn't sure yet how, but tonight everything would change. Luke reached town just as twilight fell. The lamps along Main Street were being lit, their orange glow cutting through the early dark. The town felt different now, tense, whispering. Folks moved quickly, glancing over their shoulders. Word had spread that the widow might hang if found guilty, and some said Luke had helped her do it. He tied his horse behind the old livery, keeping to the shadows. He didn't trust anyone to see what he carried. Inside his saddlebag lay the revolver, proof that could damn Silas Horn if he played it right. Luke headed straight for the sheriff's office. Tate was there, hat off, leaning over his desk when Luke came in. Found something, Luke said quietly, setting the revolver on the table. Tate's eyes widened. Where? By the creek. Same place Eli Callahan fell. The sheriff lifted the gun carefully. The initials caught the lamplight. S.H., he read aloud. Luke nodded. Silas Horn. Looks like he dropped it when he pushed Eli into that water. Tate's face hardened. If that's true, this could clear her name, but we'll need more than a gun. Horn'll say you planted it. Then we get someone who saw him there that night, Luke said. Tate rubbed his jaw. That might not be easy. Folks who cross Horn tend to vanish or change their stories. Luke looked toward the back room where Ruth sat behind the bars. Then we make sure this story can't vanish. Before the sheriff could answer, the sound of boots and horses filled the street outside. Tate stood and peeked through the blinds. Speak of the devil, he muttered. Horn was coming, not alone, but with 4 armed men and a piece of paper clutched in his hand. Luke's voice was low. He's bringing a warrant, isn't he? Tate nodded grimly. Signed by the circuit judge's deputy. It's official enough to take her to the county jail. Tonight. Ruth stood as the door burst open. Silas stepped inside, wearing that smug grin. Evening, Sheriff. I'll be taking the prisoner off your hands. Luke moved between him and Ruth's cell. You're not taking her anywhere. Horn's men drew their guns. Step aside, Cowboy. Tate raised his voice. Easy now. There'll be no bloodshed in my office. Silas smiled thinly. Then do your job, Sheriff. The law says she's mine to escort. Luke's hand twitched toward his holster. You think the law means you can kill a man, frame his wife, and walk away clean? Horn's grin faltered. Watch your tongue. Luke reached into his coat, pulling out the revolver wrapped in cloth. Funny thing, he said, unwrapping it. Found this by the creek. Your initials are still carved in it. For a heartbeat, the room went dead quiet. Horn's eyes flicked to the gun, just for an instant, but it was enough. Tate saw it too. That true, Horn? The sheriff said. Silas forced a laugh. You expect anyone to believe I dropped my own gun out there? He's framing me. Luke stepped closer, his voice steady. Then explain why there's mud on the grip. Fresh mud. Same kind that runs off the creek where Eli died. Tate laid the revolver flat on his desk. If that's your gun, I can compare the serial number. If it matches the one you registered 2 years ago, I'll have your answer. Silas's calm cracked. You got no right. I got every right, Tate snapped. You came waving a warrant, now I'm waving evidence. The men behind Horn shifted uneasily. One of them, Jed Weller, stepped back, eyes darting. Boss, he muttered. Maybe we should go. Shut your mouth, Horn hissed. But Jed didn't. His voice trembled. I saw you that night, Horn. You and Eli. You said you'd make it look like a fall, but when he fought back, Horn spun, fury twisting his face. You lying dog. He reached for his pistol, but Luke's hand was faster. The hammer clicked. Don't, Luke warned. Silas froze. Tate moved quickly, snatching the gun from his hand and twisting his arm behind his back. You just made it real easy, Horn, the sheriff said. Jed, you'll sign a statement first thing in the morning. You too, Garner. This is done by the book. Horn glared at Luke as the cuffs snapped shut. You think she'll thank you for this? You think she'll keep you around when she's free? Luke's jaw tightened. Doesn't matter, as long as she is free. Tate led Horn out, his men following in silence. When the door shut, the room felt still again, except for the faint rattle of Ruth's breath behind the bars. Luke turned. She stood there, tears shining in her eyes. You found proof, she whispered. He nodded. Enough to clear your name. Ruth smiled, small, trembling, but full of light. Eli can rest now. Luke stepped closer to the bars. And you? She looked at him for a long moment. Maybe I can finally rest too. He smiled faintly. Not yet, you've got a ranch to run. Her laugh broke through the silence, soft and fragile like dawn breaking through fog. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, cleansing, new. For the first time in a long while, Pine Hollow felt like it could breathe again. The storm broke before sunrise. Rain swept across the plains, washing dust from the fences and soot from the old barn. Ruth watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself as the water darkened the earth. It felt like the land was breathing again. Sheriff Tate had ridden out early, taking Silas Horn to the county jail. The banker hadn't spoken a word since being arrested, and word spread fast. Pine Hollow was finally free of him. When Luke stepped out of the barn, rain dripping from his hat brim, Ruth called softly, "You'll catch a cold out there." He smiled faintly. "Been colder places." She watched him cross the muddy yard the way he moved, steady, sure, like the storm couldn't touch him. But under that calm she could sense something else. Restlessness. The kind of quiet a man wears before he rides away. He stopped at the porch steps, glancing toward the open horizon. "The land'll be good this season," he said. "You've got strong soil here," Ruth nodded. "Soil's only good if someone tends it." Luke hesitated, then tipped his hat. "You'll manage." Her eyes softened. "You think I'll manage alone?" He didn't answer right away. Rain tapped against the porch roof. "I've stayed longer than I meant to," he said at last. "You don't owe me a thing." Ruth took a slow breath. "I never could pay you. Not in money. Not in words." He met her gaze. "You don't have to." She stepped closer. "When Eli died, I thought God had forgotten me. That maybe some folks weren't meant for another chance. But you showed up out of nowhere. Fixing fences, facing down men twice your size. You reminded me this land isn't just dirt and pain." Luke looked away, rain glistening on his lashes. "All I did was stay. And sometimes," Ruth said softly, "that's the hardest thing anyone can do." For a moment, they stood in silence. The widow and the drifter, the storm breaking around them. Then Ruth reached for his hand. "You said once I didn't owe you, but if I can't pay you in coin, maybe I can pay you in something else." He smiled slightly. "What's that?" "Stay," she whispered. "Not as a hired hand, as home." The words hung in the rain, gentle and certain. Luke didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the hills where dawn's first light was cutting through the clouds, thin, gold, and pure. The kind of light that made even old wounds look healed. Then he turned back to her. "You sure about that?" She smiled through the tears. "I've never been more sure." Luke took off his hat, letting the rain fall across his hair, and stepped onto the porch beside her. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Somewhere a hawk cried above the valley, circling wide and free. He looked at Ruth, at the woman who'd fought for everything she had and lost almost all of it, and he felt something settle deep inside him. Peace. "You said I didn't owe you," she murmured again. Luke shook his head. "Then pay me by letting me stay." A smile touched her lips, quiet and true. The rain softened to a drizzle. The clouds broke open just enough for the sun to touch the ranch, spilling gold across the wet grass, the fences, the roof. Luke reached for the door and opened it, holding it for her. She stepped inside first, and he followed, closing it behind them. The fire inside the hearth glowed warm and steady, chasing the last of the storm shadows away. Outside, the land breathed again, healed, cleansed, and waiting for new life. And as dawn climbed over Pine Hollow, the widow and the cowboy stood together, no longer haunted by what they'd lost, but bound by what they'd found. Home. If this story touched your heart, don't write off just yet. Hit that like button so more folks can find it, and subscribe for more Wild West tales of love, loss, and redemption. There's another story waiting on the trail, and you don't want to miss it.